Welcome and thank you all for joining the Q3 BEAD and Digital Equity Update webinar. My name is Crystal Dickerson. I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager, and I will be moderating today's session. We have a few more folks joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we will answer all questions as soon as we can. We will answer them privately in the Q&A, but then again, we will also answer them verbally in case anyone else has the same question. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Maggie Woods.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so lovely to see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces today. As Crystal mentioned, I'm Maggie Woods. I'm a digital equity manager with the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity, and I've been leading our digital equity planning process. So let me tell you a little bit about what to expect from our webinar today. So I'm going to start by providing some updates on where we are with the digital equity plan, what some of our data collection is saying early on. And then I'm going to pass it to Emily Ganji, our policy director, to give some updates on our BEAD plan, and specifically focusing on updates since June, since we had a webinar with everyone in June, and through December. And then we have some fantastic guest speakers today that I'll let Emily introduce, who are going to be talking specifically about the broadband workforce plan that's part of the BEAD planning process. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So let me just start by giving you an overview of what the digital equity plan requirements entail. So this is a reminder for folks. We have very key requirements as outlined by the Digital Equity Act. This is a broad overview. I'm happy to go deep into any of these requirements if people have questions. But first and foremost, we need to identify barriers to digital equity for the general and covered populations. And on the right side of the screen, you can see who those specific 10 covered populations are for both BEAD and digital equity. But not only do we need to identify the barriers, and I'm going to talk through kind of ways that we've been identifying barriers in just a moment, but we need to develop measurable objectives for overcoming those barriers. So it's not just naming the needs, it's how are we going to meet those needs as a state. In addition to that, we are developing an asset inventory and a needs assessment, and we'll talk specifically about the asset inventory in just a couple minutes. And then we are required by law to integrate local digital inclusion plans in the state into our state digital equity plan. And I mention this because this is really important, and I know many of the folks who are on this call and have been involved in these conversations have been a part of their local digital inclusion planning processes. So we want you to know that we are incorporating all of that local knowledge and time and resources that it took and integrating that into our state plan. And then finally, we're working across state agencies, right? We are a small team and have to work in tandem with other agencies to ensure that our plans are in alignment with other state plans. So moving on to the next slide, I did want to mention our fantastic core planning team. So these are the folks that have been in lockstep with us from the beginning to help us develop our digital equity plan. We haven't had a chance to announce them publicly, and so this is the time to do it. And so just want to give a huge thank you to these folks that have been meeting with us every other week for almost a year now as we work on developing this plan. So moving on to the next slide. As you'll recall, we talked about in June, we developed the first ever digital equity survey in the state. And this was to fill in some of the gaps that we know from the broadband survey that's been deployed for several years. And really was to dig in to some of those barriers to digital equity. Why aren't people using the internet at home, et cetera? This was available online, but also in paper copies. And it was available in 9 languages, including English. And as you can see, this survey reached 100 counties, 88% of zip codes. This is not a final analysis. We're still reviewing some of over 1,000 paper copies. So I'm not going to do a deep dive, but I just wanted to share a couple of data found really interesting, particularly the one on your right, is what is preventing people from connecting at home through a non-mobile service. And the first, of course, is that internet is not available to them. The second is that internet's too expensive. And the third is that internet is available but does not work well enough. So this definitely fits in with a lot of what we've heard through listening sessions. But I thought these final categories were really interesting. 7% said that they didn't have a digital device to connect to the internet at home, and that's why they don't have internet service. 7% said they didn't want internet at home, right? That's relevancy factor. And then another 6% said that they don't know how to use the internet. So again, preliminary findings, but really interesting. So let's move on to the next slide. And I want to talk a little bit about this asset inventory that we've also been working on. So, and you may have seen emails from us, social media from us, encouraging organizations to fill out this really comprehensive asset inventory. We're really trying to understand in every single county, where can people go to get devices? Where can they go to get digital skills training, to get technical support if their computers break, to access public devices or public internet, or to access digital inclusion funding if they're trying to develop a program. And so we did an initial scan of all of the available digital inclusion plans, strategic community plans in the state, and identified about 600 individual assets. And then we deployed this survey. And 228 organizations filled out this very comprehensive survey. And we have 94 counties represented, although before we publish this, I want a full 100 counties. And the goal of this is to help us with our needs assessment, right? To identify where barriers are and where resources are and the gaps. But this is also going to go into a public-facing database that you can choose your county and choose you're looking for, and you can find specifically where you can go to get resources. So this ultimately will be publicly available for people to use and is meant to be kind of the linchpin of developing a true digital equity ecosystem in North Carolina. So moving to the next slide shows just some very, very preliminary data on what categories these organizations filled out when they filled out our digital asset inventory survey. So you can see that public device and internet access has kind of the largest category, followed by digital skills and just straight device access, digital inclusion funding, and that kind of broader other. So a lot more to come on this, but I just kind of wanted to share some preliminary results, and we're really excited to get this public database available. Now I want to shift gears again, moving to the next slide, and share some of the work that we've been doing on very specific listening sessions that we've hosted with covered populations. And if you joined us in June, you know that we did 9 public-facing regional listening sessions where we engaged with folks and heard from folks from some of their biggest connectivity needs. Well, this is taking that model, but doing much smaller, more like focus groups, 8 to 12 individuals, semi-structured. We wanted to make sure we touched all regions, and we partnered with key organizations who had trust in the communities or who were working with organizations who had trust. So this is just a list of some of the organizations that we partnered with to host these listening sessions. And then the state came in along with some researchers to facilitate the listening sessions. And we've heard some really interesting themes, and these are just high-level preliminary results, but I wanted to share them with you today. So if we move to the next slide, one of the biggest themes we saw, of course, was a need for internet access. And it's really nuanced, right? So some of the barriers we heard were limited service providers, either one or no internet service providers in an area, inadequate broadband coverage. We heard a lot about some people, having access, but their neighbor down the road doesn't have access. General poor connectivity or data caps, particularly in rural areas. We heard a lot about affordability in rural areas, but also in urban areas of people not having internet at home because they couldn't afford it. And then we heard a lot about just the lack of community spaces to access free internet. So if you didn't have internet at home, there were limited places that you could go to get access to the internet. And so what we heard about needs to address these barriers were, more public Wi-Fi in downtown and community spaces, more options for internet service providers in areas to provide competition, more affordable service, more reliable service, and more kind of options to be able to afford the internet. And then, of course, just more infrastructure, right? Which I know Emily's going to talk about is what our BEAD and our broadband team is working on. So moving to the next slide, we also heard some really interesting preliminary kind of themes on devices or computers. So we heard a lot about just the lack of necessary equipment at home. So people may be having a laptop, but the laptop was given to them through the school system and had to be returned for the summer, or maybe having a laptop or a computer, but it either being too old to use and was kind of non-functional, or just not enough computers in a household, right? They have a number of household members who need computers and just one or two computers. And so again, kind of really nuanced with like what lack of necessary equipment looks like. Many families also talked about the need for other kinds of equipment, so needing printers so students could print their homework that was required for school. And then we also heard about the need for more public devices in public spaces, but also that there are, of course, limits to that, right? Often, if you're going to a library to use a public computer, it has time limits, or there's things that you cannot do. And so kind of that tension of needing more public devices, but there being limits on how you can use public devices and for how long. And so then we also heard some really interesting themes around digital skills training, if we move to the next slide. So we did several sessions kind of focused on aging individuals, and some of their, they indicated some of the greatest needs for just basic digital literacy and internet safety training. Though I'll say, particularly with internet safety, we heard across the board the need for better understanding of how do you keep your data private and how do you keep yourself and your family safe online. We also did 2 sessions focused on people in reentry, specifically on both their experiences while incarcerated and their experiences coming back into society. And there was a note of, some having access to very kind of specialized online courses, but that the amount of time they could use tablets or computers while imprisoned was very limited and not really adequate, and that many people left not knowing kind of basic digital literacy and not knowing how to use a smartphone, and that really ensuring that you have a smartphone when reentering society and you know how to use it is very key to finding a job and to finding transportation, to finding food, and kind of all the basics that you need to survive and thrive. And then just generally a need for more digital literacy training across the state. We heard over and over again, and particularly people wanting to receive training from folks that look like them and that are from their community and either literally or figuratively speak their language, right? They want to learn from people who are of their community. Telehealth is also brought up a number of times, both as an interest for gaining healthcare through telehealth and either not having the skills or the internet to do it, or just being able to navigate like MyChart and having trouble connecting with the healthcare system because of a lack of skill set. And moving on to the next slide, one of the just findings we found across the board, and I think every single listening session, was individuals wanted to ensure that local organizations were being supported that already had the community trust. So we asked a lot of, if you were in our shoes and had the power to invest, where would you invest? And, people who are going to their local food pantry to receive food also want to receive digital literacy training, also want to receive computers through that food pantry. So thinking about how do you invest where community members are already going. And then I think this is my final slide, at least on preliminary findings. If we go to the next slide in just a moment, was kind of existing resources. Where are people already accessing resources? So again, free public Wi-Fi spaces were common places people would go, and a need for more of those, though transportation remained an issue, right? Getting to those spaces can be hard, both in urban and rural areas. Hotspots was a real need, both buses with hotspots, but hotspots in general of kind of that stopgap or being able to have access while we wait for internet build out. Faith-based organizations and churches were named as that should be key partners, particularly focusing on digital literacy training and free access to Wi-Fi. Community colleges, as well as other anchor institutions, were named as key resources for accessing digital skills. And then finally, discussing of language barriers, right? There are key challenges for folks who are non-native English speakers, and how can you integrate digital skills into already existing English language programs and courses. So these are kind of preliminary findings of what we've heard through these listening sessions. We'll be doing a comprehensive report, and all of this will be developed in the Digital Equity Plan. And then my final slide before I pass this on to Emily is just to make you aware of some resources. So we just published digital inclusion profiles on the state level, by council of government, regional level, as well as by the county level. These are in PowerPoint format, so you can kind of look and see what might be helpful and integrate them into presentations you're already given. This is the link. Please check them out. They are very comprehensive. We're also going to be publishing a digital equity interactive map of census level data focused on digital equity. That's going to be coming very soon. And then just a note, our plan will be available for public comment mid-November, early December. And our goal as a division is to get as much public comment as possible. We want to know what we did right, but more importantly, we want to know what we missed so that we can make it better. And so highly encourage you to be involved in that process and to read it and let us know. So again, that was a very quick overview of where we are in a digital equity planning process. I'd be happy to answer questions through the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to pass it to Emily Ganji, our policy director, to talk about BEAD updates. Emily?
Thank you, Maggie, and thanks for all that great work. Maggie's put a lot of mileage on her vehicle in the last 6 months getting out around the state, and we're really grateful for that and all the folks that we've been able to reach because of it. As Maggie said, I'm Emily Ganji, and I'm the policy director for the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. And I'm joined for the rest of our webinar today by Cynthia Liston with Liston Consulting and John Quinterno with South by North Strategies, who are two folks who've been integral to helping us with developing our state's broadband workforce plan that's part of our BEAD planning and will be part of our initial proposal that we submit in December. But before we get to the workforce piece, I want to share some other exciting updates with you. So many of you have seen this map, but we look at it a lot because to us this represents the mission. So the exciting news is that since we were last together in June, the FCC updated their mapping data and responded to most of our challenges that we had submitted from the state based on feedback that we received from residents and local governments and providers and various people in our state. North Carolina increased the number of unserved locations recognized by the FCC's broadband mapping by 115,000 locations, which was the greatest increase of any state in the nation. And that's due to the hard work of a lot of people, but especially led by Stephanie Jane Edwards, who's our mapping and data lead in the division, and our partners at the Friday Institute, who help us with a lot of data. And also thanks to those of you on the call and people around the state who helped us get the word out about how and educate folks about how to submit a challenge to the FCC mapping. And so based on that increase in unserved locations, that according to our best estimates, that increased our BEAD funding allocation by about $300 to $350 million, which will make a real impact on addressing this challenge in our state and making sure we achieve universal service. So we're grateful for that. We also did receive our notice of our BEAD funding allocation from the NTIA and the U.S. Department of Commerce in late June and learned that our state will get $1.53 billion. Good job, Crystal, transitioning the slide without me asking. So we're very excited by that allocation. We are one of the top 10 largest allocations in the nation, and we feel confident that this funding is going to go a long way to helping us achieve universal service in our state. And we're hopeful that we'll have some left after all the infrastructure investments to put toward all the digital equity programming that we want to do as well. That'll be part of the digital equity plan that Maggie spoke to you about earlier. So the first thing we've got to do with this money from BEAD is to serve all unserved. Crystal, if you could go back one. Is to serve all unserved homes and businesses in our state and make sure they have access to the internet infrastructure. The funds can also be used to upgrade infrastructure for community anchor institutions. So community anchor institutions could be schools or higher education or healthcare facilities or libraries, could be public housing authorities. Basically, it's places that are key places in the community that serve vulnerable populations and where folks can access the internet outside of their homes or businesses. And so we're going to be putting together a list of community anchor institutions in our state and doing our best to determine what current speeds and service they have available. And we can use this funding to increase their service, to upgrade them to have 1 gig symmetrical, which would be great for a lot of places in our state. And if so, in our plan, if we can prove that we're going to be able to do those two things, then we can also use some of this BEAD money for the digital equity purposes that I mentioned earlier, like affordability and devices and Wi-Fi and other places. So we're really hopeful we're going to stretch this money as far as we can. Now you can go to the next one, Crystal. So this is a brief timeline. The orange dots mean the things we've already done. So another one of those things we got done this summer that you all helped with was that we posted our BEAD 5-year plan for public comment in June and received comments until July. And we got really substantive feedback from a lot of folks, and we're grateful for that. And we used that to refine our plan before we submitted it to the NTIA at the end of July. And we heard back in August that it was approved. So I'll share a link about that in just a minute. But the other big thing that happened this summer is that our Broadband Workforce Advisory Committee began meeting to work on our state's workforce plan that we're going to focus on today. So as Maggie already mentioned, the digital equity plan will be going up for public comments this fall. And the BEAD initial proposal will be going up for public comments in November as well. And then that'll be due to the NTIA by December 27th. A lot of us want to celebrate the holidays, so we're going to try to get it in before then, but that is the official deadline. NTIA has told us that they expect to take action on all the initial proposals by the end of February. And so sometime in the spring of 2024, we should be able to draw down the first 20% of this BEAD funding based on approval of our initial proposal. So in 2024, we'll also be doing our challenge process with regard to what locations will be eligible for the BEAD funding. And we'll be doing our subgrantee selection process to determine who will be eligible to receive grants from these funds in our state. And then finally, we'll submit a final proposal in December 2024 to NTIA with what we've learned from that first year of funding and what we need to modify going forward. And once that's approved, we'll be able to draw down the remaining 80% of our BEAD funding allocation. So basically, we've still got a long road to go through 2028, but we've made a lot of progress since we last spoke. Next one, please, Crystal. So as I mentioned, our 5-year plan was approved and it's posted on our website. We'll drop the link in the chat for you too, since I know this is a long one and hard to remember. But please do take a look at that 5-year plan to help you think about what the 5-year plan is versus the initial and final proposal. The way I've heard folks at NTIA describe it, and I use this too, is that this 5-year plan that was due this summer is really strategic. So kind of the big vision, and then the initial proposal is going to get much more tactical, which you'll see in a minute when you see the list of components that have to be included. So you can go to the next one, Crystal. So this is the first of 3 slides with the sections that are required for the initial proposal that's due in December. As I mentioned, we'll submit a list of all the unserved and underserved locations in our state And we'll describe the challenge process that we're going to use in 2024 so that various stakeholders can challenge that list and that mapping and let us know if there are any errors that we need to correct. The other key piece that I want to mention on this slide is that we'll submit a list of community anchor institutions in our state. And part of what has to be submitted is that we have to submit the speeds of service that are currently available at those institutions. So if you're on the call today and you can help us with providing lists of community anchor institutions in our state, and especially contact information so we can get in touch with those folks and get the speeds that they have available at their location, or get them to take our broadband survey so that they can run a speed test, that will really help us to make sure that we've include all the community anchor institutions in our state. We don't want to leave anybody out who's eligible. So you can help us there if you're willing and have information to share. Next slide, please. On this slide, the piece that I wanted to highlight is the workforce readiness requirement that we're going to focus on today. So we know that between the $1 billion that our state has invested with American Rescue Plan Act funding and the $1.5 billion that will be invested from this BEAD infrastructure funding, that's going to be a big investment in a short amount of time in our state, and it's going to create a lot of new jobs. And in order to meet these ambitious timelines that we have from our state and from the federal government, we're going to need to make sure we have the workforce who's trained and available to do this deployment and to construct these networks that are going to help us achieve universal service in our state. So we're spending a lot of time and with the benefit of a lot of thoughtful partners to develop a plan for how we're going to make sure we have the workforce that we need for this deployment. And so we're going to focus a good bit of time on that today. Next slide, please, Crystal. And then finally, on this last slide, affordability is also an important part of BEAD, just as it is with digital equity. And so part of the initial proposal involves making sure there's a low-cost broadband service option available in our state. And something new that a lot of folks haven't talked a lot about yet is that we also have to consider a middle class affordability and how we're going to try to ensure that the middle class has affordable options as well. And then the really exciting part will be the eligible entity regulatory approach, where we describe how our state is going to resolve the discrepancies between state law and federal regulations where they don't agree everywhere, and how we're going to handle that. So that will be one of the more exciting sections to read, I feel sure. Next slide, please, Crystal. So as I mentioned, I've already made the case for why a workforce is critical to achieving universal service and to the BEAD deployment. So we convened an advisory committee who's been advising us since this summer in developing this plan and helping us to conduct to determine what needs exist for workers in our state and what existing skills and certifications are available and what we may need to expand or scale out in our state. We're also considering strategies that we could use to build the workforce where we don't have it, and what investments will be needed to make that happen. And we've also got a really strong focus on improving equity in this sector and making sure that what we do helps to diversify the broadband sector workforce. So I think the next slide, we're going to acknowledge the great folks who are helping us. So I'm not going to name everybody, but we wanted you to see the representation that we have from education providers in our state and internet service providers and local officials and associations. And these folks have been a really committed group and a really engaged group who helps us out and answers our questions between meetings as well. And so we're really grateful to them for agreeing to serve on this advisory committee this fall and help us develop this plan. Next slide, please, Crystal. So as I mentioned, we've been doing some occupational analysis to get a sense of the quantitative side of things that John Quinterno has been leading, and is going to give you an overview of in just a moment. And then we've also been doing interviews and listening sessions with employers and internet service providers and a lot of the education partners in our state and a number of trade associations who have credentials that they offer around the nation. So between all this qualitative and quantitative data that we've gathered, and then the integral input that we're getting from the advisory committee and a lot of national resources as they become available, we feel really good about the direction that this workforce plan is taking. So now I'm going to turn it over to John first, who's going to share some of the labor analysis information with you. And then Cynthia will follow him and share more about what we've learned about what credentials are already available and what we may need to do to expand those in our state. So John and Cynthia, thank you again for being such important partners in this work. We're grateful to you for your expertise.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Emily, and thank you to everyone on the call. As Emily said, my name is John Quinterno, and I've been helping with the labor and workforce analysis component of the plan. And I would say just right off the bat, as Emily said, this is a very exciting opportunity to receive this money and to provide the expansion of services across the state. At the same time, this is going to happen in a very short period of time. We're talking about a 5-year window, and there's going to be a need for a lot of folks to be involved in actually building out this network. So there is going to be an employment impact. And so we're trying to get a sense of, for planning purposes, what might that look like. But I think one challenge that comes up, and where we start with sort of on the next slide here, is that from in terms of a statistical purposes, there really is no such thing as the broadband sector. You have business establishments engaged in specific industries, you have workers engaged in specific occupations, and those categories don't necessarily line up. So one thing we started off with doing was trying to identify what we thought the 6 most critical industries were for our purposes in North Carolina, along with the 20 most impacted occupations. So you'll see a couple of things that differentiate North Carolina. One of which is, as we see on the last point, compared to most or many other places in the country, our sector is a little different in that we actually do a good bit of fiber and cable manufacturing in the state. That is something that we do here. And also, if you look then more specifically at the jobs we're talking about, in 2021, there were about 36,000 payroll positions that we would have been associated with these industries, and about 60% of those were connected to either wired telecommunications carriers or wireless telecommunications carriers. So we had those issues as well. So that just gives you a very high level overview. We've got industries, we've got occupations. In the extensive technical report that goes with this, we go into all of that in a lot more detail. Today, I'm going to focus a bit more on the occupation side of things, because that's closer to or more aligned with people doing jobs in the way we might commonly think of that. So that provides some context there. Moving then to the occupational analysis, there are those 20 occupations, and I'll show those in a minute. Most of these, or the most critical ones, are generally in the installation, maintenance, and repair fields. These would be occupations like line installers and repairers. These are by and large jobs that require some level of education and training above and beyond high school, but not necessarily a 4-year university degree. In general, these are jobs that provide higher wages and benefits than is typical. But if you were to add it all up and sort of assume from a modeling purpose, which I'll talk about, if all this money were to come into North Carolina immediately, we would, you could estimate that there might be 6,100 or so jobs created above and beyond what would be needed to keep up with the field in general, to accommodate things like retirements and whatnot. And so on the one hand, that's not necessarily a huge number. On the other hand, it will require training and thinking and a strategy for how to provide and create that workforce. And that probably is going to mean, because of the time frame we're working with, the vendors or the individual firms probably won't be able to do this all themselves, and it's probably going to require more partnership and collaboration with educational institutions than might otherwise be the case. So moving to provide just a few more details, and then this will all, again, as outlined in much more depth in the technical report, but if we look at the next slide, this gives you a sense of those key occupations. So the ones that are highlighted in yellow or green, depending on your screen, give you the ones that are considered the most essential. So those would be things like telecommunications installers, line installers, electrical power lines, equipment tower and equipment installers. You see those, and that gives you the list there. And basically, just if you were to combine, moving over to across the columns, if you assume, based on what we know about the industry structure, some other modeling that's been done, if North Carolina gets roughly $2.5 billion in federal funds between BEAD and existing funds, you would get the impact that we would have about 6,100 jobs, and you can see the breakdown there, with the single biggest group being potentially the equipment installers and repairers, followed by the line installers, which makes sense if we're going to be laying all this, say, fiber optic line all around the state. So that just gives you a sense there of the distribution of potential jobs. Again, this is a model. I wouldn't say any of this is set in stone, but it's really more to give us a sense for planning purposes, sort of the direction where this could go and where key areas are. And again, we've vetted this so far with the Workforce Advisory Group Emily referenced, and they've been pretty much on board with the general tone, tenor, the direction of the findings. So that is something to note there. Moving forward then, just a few points about the jobs themselves. As I mentioned a moment ago, you would see that with two exceptions, all of the key occupations generally require something between a high school degree, but not necessarily a four-year degree. You'll see that in most of the key occupations that they have a higher median wage than is typical in North Carolina, though of course that also will vary by region of the state too. And that a relatively high shares of workers in these fields compared to others or all in the state are more apt to have access to certain kinds of key employment benefits, retirement, medical insurance, paid leave. So these are generally jobs that I think folks would consider to be higher quality or would stack up well on those key measures. One difference that we have in North Carolina compared to the rest of the nation is that this is a workforce in our state that is less likely to be members of labor unions or to be covered by collective bargaining arrangements than is the case nationally for the field. So that just gives you a sense there. And then if we move to the next slide, this just it goes back and says, okay, here are those kinds of jobs in some of those fields, like the line installers and the power installers. These would, if you looked at the job quality, all wind up being generally above typical in North Carolina. And if you basically just took that and then looked at it a little differently, you would say that for these fields, we have in the first column what our baseline expected growth would be in those fields, and then what would happen due to BEAD and this additional federal funding. So if you took that and then annualized it, we're looking at an estimate of around 682 additional jobs over the 5-year period. And so that just gives you a sense of what we are thinking about and what we need to plan for. The last point then, just moving to the demography, is of course need to think a little bit about who works in the field, where the workers are or who they are currently, where they might come from. And with that, you can see that in general, the existing industry tends to rely on a largely male workforce. It generally skews older. The workers tend to identify more often than not as non-Hispanic white. There are differences, of course, in the field as well, and you can see some of the clusters where you're more apt to find, say, Hispanic and African American workers. But generally speaking, even before the BEAD program occurred, this is a field by and large with workers that are generally facing a lot of turnover. You have a workforce that is getting much closer to exiting the workforce to the latter part of their career. And so that was going to be a challenge already. And now, of course, we're going to need to replace those folks and bring in additional demand as well, which probably means that, as I said at the outset, we need to think about different strategies. And I think Cynthia is going to talk about that. Think about how firms can work together, how state institutions like community colleges can play a role, because again, this very short time frame means it's unlikely that any one firm is going to be able to solve this problem or create a pipeline, if you will, a talent flow by itself. So that's the very high level overview of what we've been looking at and where we're targeting things. And then I think we can turn it over to, I guess, Cynthia there to get more into what people are saying about skills and training and the needs of what qualifications they need from a potential workforce.
Great. Thank you so much, John. I echo my appreciation for being with you this afternoon and having this opportunity to share what we've been learning and the direction that we're headed as we craft this workforce development plan. So I will go ahead and we can advance to the next slide and just share kind of the information gathering that we've been doing so far. And then I'll share a little bit about some of the draft strategies that we're currently considering. So we did convene 2 employer listening sessions in June. I think, as Emily mentioned, to really connect with internet service providers. We had about 15 who took part, and we wanted to hear from them, what they consider the priority jobs. We knew that we had some of this quantitative analysis that John has been leading for the state, but we wanted to sort of match that up with what we were hearing directly from employers in terms of their talent needs, their kind of labor market pain points, as well as the credentials that and skills that they're looking for when they're out there hiring. We also wanted to hear from them how they're finding and retaining employees now, what kind of partnerships they already have with education partners, and efforts that they have underway to diversify the workforce. And so we had really robust conversations with these employers. And if you go to the next slide, I can share what we heard at a large, kind of at the high level. So next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. So this kind of is a synopsis of a lot of information, but just to kind of give you the flavor of those conversations, one thing that we did learn is that there are credentials that are out there now to train in this field. And specifically, we kind of honed in on, and this really supported the work that John has done as well around these installers, and in the field they're kind of called fiber technicians, right? So these are the folks who are helping install, splice the cable, and really connect service to residences and institutions, right? And that's where there's a lot of need, as we saw in the data. And so we learned that there are credentials and training out there, but that it's there's not exactly, has not been a coalescing around a singular credential that's widely in use in this field right now. And part of that, one of the things that we heard is that traditionally for these companies, a lot of the training has happened post-employment versus pre-employment, right? So folks are getting training after they've been hired. But what we heard very clearly from employers is, particularly given this big influx of resources that's going to be coming to the state and sort of concerns about workforce, that having more credentialed individuals out there who've already gone through some level of training would be really beneficial to really make sure that we've got the workforce we need to do this. We also did hear that proximity to training is important to employers. They're hitting the ground running and they don't have a lot of bandwidth to send people far away for training. And we heard we want North Carolinians, as John said, these are good jobs and we want North Carolinians to have these jobs. And so making sure we have access points around the state is really important. We did have employers who talked about some community college partnerships as well as partnerships with high schools, but generally most of those are new or developing. And a lot of conversation from employers about the fact they would like to see more young people come into this field and to really start that recruitment process at a young age if possible. Again, we did hear about some specific efforts that some companies are doing to create a more diverse workforce. And then I would say just finally, at a very large level, we heard that there is a need to articulate this career path both to young people and adults who may be considering a career change, and sort of articulate what that career pathway looks like. I think being a fiber technician is a great sort of entry level job, but it may not be the job that somebody wants to do for their career. And so one of the things that we heard is there's probably more progress that could be made around showing what career advancement looks like, and that sort of will make the sector seem even more attractive to potential workers. So next slide, please, Crystal. So turning then to the education and training side of things, we did do a capacity scan this summer, had conversations primarily with community college leaders around the state, as well as national associations who are very active in supporting training and workforce development in this sector, as well as an entity, a manufacturer in the state that's actually doing training themselves. And from them, we really wanted to hear, like, what are their current assets? What are the jobs that they're currently providing training for? Who they're partnering with? What they think we can build from in terms of assets that are similar to or already in place to support training for broadband workers, and then also just the barriers and opportunities that they saw having some experience in this space. So, advancing to the next slide. What we heard is, well, first of all, we did identify that there are a handful of colleges that have offered some training in this space. Not all of it has been directly for fiber installation, right? Because this is a newer technology, but is of course the focus of the BEAD investment. But we do know that a couple of community colleges have done some non-credit training. So this is like outside of the degree programs, but kind of more short-term workforce-oriented training. And then there are a few other colleges that have done some training in the past in this space. So we think they may have some assets to leverage, but have not been doing it most recently. And then there are a couple of colleges that are considering implementing fiber tech courses as we speak. We also learned that there's some capacity on the credit bearing side. So these are 2-year degree programs. Again, perhaps not directly relevant, but certainly bringing some of the same skill sets and expertise within those institutions that we think can support the broadband sector and the growth that we're going to see in the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So in terms of barriers and opportunities and having those conversations with the education partners in the state who have some experience in this space, we heard a couple of things. On the barrier side, these are not inexpensive programs to run. And so we do see, and we heard that there are some high startup costs, particularly not just the initial equipment, but also some of the ongoing consumables that students who are doing this hands-on work need to have to kind of get the experience in this space. We talked a little bit about apprenticeships and some of the challenges around finding on the employer side, the journeyman who needs to sort of sponsor an apprentice in the workplace. We heard a lot about finding qualified instructors, and that's something that we're really going to need to focus on in this plan and think creatively about who we're going to tap to do the training in this space. And then, frankly, we also heard that, on the education side, this scale of this investment, I think, is just starting to kind of dawn on some of our education partners, and they have not been completely sure about the numbers being solid and wanting to know if they invest in this space, what does that look like over the long term in terms of sustainability of these jobs and these training programs. We also did hear on the opportunities side that there are some adjacent industries where there's some crossover in terms of skills and that we can really leverage as we think about training in this space. EV charging, clean tech, construction were clear kind of crossover industries. Also, definitely sort of similar to the conversation around career pathways from employers, there is this opportunity to start with some short-term training programs that might get folks into that first level job working as a fiber tech. And that career advancement could mean continuing their education into a 2-year degree program. We also know that for some students, wraparound supports are going to be really important to make sure they can access and complete training. This is particularly true if we start thinking about efforts to diversify the workforce. And so that's something that we're going to really think about and build into this plan. As I mentioned before, I think, and I'm going to kind of go into this, I think, in the next slide, but just thinking regionally about how to meet training needs in the state is important. And that there's lots of opportunities for partnerships, particularly with workforce boards and aligned funders, to really lean in and support this work as we get to implementation. So next slide, please. So just to share kind of at a high level the direction that we're headed and thinking about the workforce strategies that we want to include in the plan. We've kind of put them in 2 buckets for now. This may change as we get farther down the road, but this is the way that we've got it organized right now. And just wanted to share these with you again, so that you just sort of see the direction that we're headed. And if you have other feedback, suggestions, feel free to reach out, because we are still, we will be wrapping this up this fall, but we still are open to new suggestions as well. So as I mentioned, I think developing that fiber tech training and kind of on a regional basis, particularly at community colleges, and making sure they're offering credentials that are really valued by the sector. And so we're going to be doing some work around sort of defining what those credentials are. We also want the internet service providers and manufacturers to be our partners in this work. And so we're thinking about how we can incentivize partnership in terms of equipment, consumables, instructors, possibly even sharing some space where the training could take place is another idea that we've had. And this third one is a little bit different, just because it's not at that sort of less than a 2-year level. But we have heard that there's a need to attract some more engineers and network architects who obviously have 4-year degrees to this sector, and that if we can do that, we can help perhaps reduce some of the costs from the ISP standpoint of designing and building these networks. And if we can do that, that means the dollars that we have from the federal government will stretch even farther. So that's something that we're really interested in. We also want to partner with community organizations and make sure that we are leveraging what they have to offer in terms of helping to recruit and support training in this space. I've mentioned the career pathways, and these career pathways can also start in high school, and that's something we have robust career technical education programs and opportunities for high school students to start college programs while they're still in high school. And so we think that's a way to also kind of really boost that talent pipeline for this sector. So next, I think that was my last slide. Yes. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you today, and I'm going to turn it over to Emily now.
Thank you, Cynthia. So last, we just want to offer a glimpse of what's next in the planning process. So we'll continue doing outreach such as this webinar and gathering information from stakeholders across the state like you, and doing a lot of analysis and a lot of writing and drafting these plans. Some key dates, we're targeting November 6th to post a draft of our BEAD initial proposal volumes 1 and 2 for public comments, and also aiming to post a draft of our digital equity plan in November for public comment as well. We're still debating about when our next webinar should be in terms of, but we know it'll be in November or December. But with we want to make sure we maximize the opportunity to get your input. So we're thinking about, we'll let you know the date as soon as we have settled on it. And then in December, the target is that public comments for the BEAD initial proposal would be due December 5th. And then that would give us a few weeks to review those comments and incorporate them in refining our BEAD initial proposal that's due to the NTIA on December 27th. So we've got 5 minutes left to take some questions, and appreciate Maggie answering some as we went along as well. But Crystal, we'll turn it over to you to moderate the questions.
Thank you so much. There were a few links put in the chat. I wanted to make sure you all saw it. The main one is ncbroadband.gov/BEAD, and you can find a lot of information about our BEAD planning efforts, as well as our digital equity planning efforts and the workforce group that Emily just spoke to. So one of the questions we received was, are churches considered community anchor institutions? And I will toss that to Emily, please. Emily and Maggie.
Sure. I'll start and Maggie chime in if you want to add anything. Each state gets to define community anchor institutions based on guidance from the federal government. And we're still working on our definition, but I would say that faith-based organizations would certainly be included in community anchor institutions. And the criteria would most likely be that they're serving those covered populations that are a focus of the BEAD and digital equity planning, and that they're providing access to resources, whether it's to the internet or to devices that would help folks get on the internet, or to skills training, to basically help them be able to engage on the internet successfully. So we would certainly be interested in faith-based organizations.
Wonderful. We had a follow-up question about the estimated date for the release of the digital equity plan. Maggie, can you take that one, please?
Yep. So the goal is November 15th, but we're saying kind of somewhere before the end of the year, and hoping to have that plan up for 45 days. 30 days is the requirement, but since we know we're going to be going over the holidays, we want to give ample opportunity for people to provide comments.
Fantastic. And for those of you looking for more information on our BEAD allocations, as well as the mapping challenges process, we have quite a bit under the news section of ncbroadband.gov. If you go in the upper right nav and click news, you can see all of our press releases, which have a lot of information there about both of those items, as well as digital equity and everything we're doing here in the office and the division overall. So our next question is, let's see, what were the 6 key industries? And I believe that was aimed at John. John, if you are not available to answer the question.
I'm
Oh,
here.
there you
I
are.
just didn't hear what you said. I'm sorry, Crystal.
Sure. Someone had asked what the 6 key industries were that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation.
And I posted those in the chat a little earlier. So if you scroll up, you'll see them listed there. So
Okay.
power and communication, line construction, fiber optic cable manufacturing, electrical equipment, cable systems, and then wired and wireless telecom, with the wired and wireless telecom being the 2 key ones that are responsible for around 60% of all employment in the field.
Perfect. Thank you so much for verbally adding that for anyone who didn't see the chat. This presentation will be accessible to watch again following the conclusion. We will put a recording of it as well as the slides up on our website at ncbroadband.gov/BEAD. You can see all of our previous quarterly updates there as well. And then Emily had asked or had actually posted in the chat where a 5-year plan is. You can access that from ncbroadband.gov/BEAD. And then under that page, the ncbroadband.gov/BEAD, there we go again. I'm going to keep referencing that. You can find more information about our digital equity resources, including those digital inclusion profiles that are available by county or by different COG or for the state overall. Let's see what else we have. I think no. There's some questions in here about looking for opportunities to incentivize high school apprenticeships and some links to that. I think those are all the questions we have. Do we have any final questions before we close? We have one. Here we go. Have you all talked with internet service providers or contractors on developing programs in-house in addition to formal education institutions? Emily?
Actually, I think I could take that one.
Oh,
Go
perfect.
ahead, Cynthia.
So we have, and actually that is kind of what we have heard is often the case now, is that there are in-house training programs. I think the question there is how formal or not formal they are, and if it's a set of, if they earn a credential that they could actually take with them to another provider as well, is one of the questions that we have. So we have definitely had those conversations, and contractors are a big piece of this equation as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Cynthia. And since we are now right at time, I appreciate you all for joining. Thank you so much for the questions. We will again be placing a copy of this recorded session on our website along with the slides. It will all be available later this week at ncbroadband.gov/BEAD. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.